In August 1305, the crowd in London was waiting for more than just an execution. They were waiting for a spectacle. When the cart carrying William Wallace entered Smithfield Square, the people already knew who had been brought there. This man's name was known throughout England and Scotland, a name that had become synonymous with rebellion. Wallace was not the most powerful of the Scottish lords. He had no title, no estates, and no dynastic support. But he became the man England feared more than any army. To London, he was a traitor. To ordinary Scots, he was a reminder that even an empire could tremble. As he was dragged through the city, the rope cut into his neck and stones flew from both sides. However, some people did not throw anything. They just watched. Not at the criminal, but at the man who was being destroyed to set an example. In medieval England, the body had meaning. It was the property of the crown. The king could chop off a head, burn entrails, or stretch limbs. Not for the sake of justice, but to remind people that even after death, a subject belonged to the authorities. It was the language of power, and today it spoke through the body of William Wallace. His execution was not meant to be just a punishment. It was meant to be a lesson for anyone who believed that freedom was possible. When the executioners prepared the noose, when the crowd began to shout, England showed what it was capable of doing to those who challenged it. But there are things that do not die even when the body stops breathing. Sometimes death only reveals the story that people tried to end. When King Alexander III died in 1286, Scotland lost more than just a ruler. It lost its center of gravity. His heir, little Margaret, the Norwegian maiden, died on her way from Norway 1290, and with her, the last direct link to legitimate power disappeared. In a country where every lord had his own army and his own vision of the future, the empty throne became an invitation to anarchy. No one was strong enough to rule, but everyone was ambitious enough to try. Edward I, King of England, saw an opportunity. Under the pretext of mediation, he forced the Scottish pretenders to swear allegiance to him as arbiter. In reality, it was an occupation carried out without war. He was called the Hammer of the Scots, and he quickly lived up to that name. Garrisons, taxes, London courts, everything was under English control. The Scottish barons argued, but they obeyed. Some out of fear, some out of convenience. The common people remained silent. Deep in the country, among the moors and hills, the first signs of resistance appeared. Night attacks, burned warehouses, missing officials. But this resistance did not yet have a real face. Wallace was born at about the time when England had already established itself in Scottish castles. His origins were not peasant, as later ballads would claim, but neither were they noble. He belonged to the lower knighthood, people who knew what a sword was but had no influence. For people like him, the new order meant humiliation. Their own land could fall under the authority of an English judge, even without a verdict. Anyone who opposed it became a traitor to the King of England, even if they were simply defending their home. And yet, beneath the outward calm, Scotland was seething. There was no king, there were no laws, but something else was emerging. Anger that had no target. Historians would later call this period the interregnum. For the people who lived through it, it was a time when no one ruled, but everyone could be punished. It was out of this chaos that William Wallace emerged. Not an heir, not a commander, but a man who was the first to say aloud what others were only thinking. Scotland could live without a king, but not without dignity. Spring 1297. The small town of Lanark lived under English laws, under English guard, and under a silence that was maintained out of fear. At that time, any word against the king could cost you your life. But sometimes silence was also deadly. Sheriff William Heselrigg was known for his cruelty. He didn't just collect taxes. He showed that the authorities could destroy anyone who dared to resist. According to some sources, Wallace saw the sheriff order the killing of his wife, Marion Braidfoot. According to others, the conflict erupted because of the Englishman's tyranny in the city. The version with Marion appears in later stories and remains a subject of controversy. Historians disagree, but everyone agrees on one thing. That day, Wallace raised his sword, and for the first time he did not hide it. The attack on Heselrigg was lightning fast. Wallace and several of his comrades broke into the sheriff's house and stabbed him to death with his own sword. It was not a political assassination. It was a message. In a country where even whispers were feared, someone had openly struck a man who embodied fear. The sheriff's body was left lying in the street. The English garrison, which arrived later, found neither the culprits nor the brave souls who would speak up. The people of Lanark were silent, but this time it was different. From that moment on, the name of William Wallace began to spread faster than the king's orders could stop it. First in whispers, then as a song sung by those who had no weapons. The fire had already been lit, and no authority could guess how much flame was hidden in the land it considered conquered. September 1297, 11th. Two armies stood outside the city of Stirling. The English had knights, heavy cavalry, thousands of soldiers, and the confidence that this day would end the rebellion forever. The Scots had swamps, wooden spears, and a man who was the subject of rumors. The bridge over the Forth was narrow, so narrow that only a few dozen horsemen could cross it at a time. Wallace knew this, and he waited. He allowed the English cavalry to reach the middle of the crossing while the rest of their troops were still behind. When the front ranks were cut off from the rest, he gave the signal. The Scots attacked head-on and from the sides. The marshes sucked in the horses. The horsemen drowned in their own armor. Screams and clanging echoed off the water. The English tried to retreat, but the narrow bridge turned the retreat into a stampede. Many died in the water in the panic. The battle lasted only a few minutes, but that was enough for England to experience defeat for the first time where it was accustomed to commanding. More than 1,500 of its soldiers were killed. Among the dead was the royal treasurer Hugh Cressingham. As the bodies of English knights covered the shore, Wallace stood silently. The victory was so complete that no one could believe it. On that day, William Wallace became not just a commander, he became a legend. For Scotland, a symbol. For England, a threat that must be destroyed. But even victory had a price. When the people begin to see a person not as a person, but as a symbol, that person loses the right to be themselves. From that moment on, Wallace no longer belonged to himself. He belonged to a country that wanted faith in him, not doubt. After Stirling, Scotland felt for the first time in many years that it could speak out loud. Wallace was proclaimed Guardian of Scotland, defender of the kingdom on behalf of the missing king. He did not seek this power, but power found him. For the first time in a long time, caravans set out from the north, letters to Hamburg and Lubeck. Wallace wrote in foreign languages, sought allies, and offered trade. The world had to see. Scotland was alive and had a voice. In these letters, the Scots called themselves those who regained their freedom with God's help, and effectively signaled to merchants that trade was resuming. But even those who had stood by him yesterday began to distance themselves. The barons who had supported him in the uprising were now afraid. Wallace had no title, no lineage, and this frightened those who were accustomed to power belonging only to them. He was too popular, too independent, too straightforward. Meanwhile, the English were not sleeping. King Edward returned from the war in Flanders and wanted revenge. His armies marched north again, burning, hanging, and destroying cities. And Wallace, who just yesterday had been a symbol of victory, now had to hold together a country torn between the ambitions of the nobility and the fear of revenge. The chronicles say that he was cruel. They say that in battle he showed no mercy to prisoners. They say that he made a belt for his sword from the body of the English treasurer Hugh Cressingham. Historians argue, but even if this is not true, it was not invented by accident. It was a portrait of a man whom the world no longer saw as a human being, but only as retribution. His face became a threat even to those who had once sworn allegiance to him. Because a hero who has survived battle begins to remind the authorities that their power can be lost. Microtransition. But the empire returned faster than the Allies, and with it came the archers. Not much time had passed since the victory at Stirling, but it seemed like a lifetime. The country that had recently been shouting with joy was now burning again, this time from English torches. King Edward returned from the war in Flanders, and with him came an army that no river or wall could stop. Wallace knew that there was almost no chance. His army was exhausted, his allies had scattered, and his supplies were running out. The barons who had called him a hero just yesterday were now silently departing, each to his own castle. Loyalty had its limits when an empire stood nearby. The Battle of Falkirk, July 22, 1298, was what everyone feared, but no one could avoid. The Scots held their ground in shield walls, tight circles of spearmen who were supposed to form a wall against the cavalry. But when the English archers opened fire, the field shook. Arrows pierced even the shields, and horses knocked down their own men. The wall broke, and the cavalry finished the rest. The field turned into a meat grinder. In a few hours, everything that still held the country together disappeared. He saw people he knew by name fall. He saw those who had sworn yesterday to stand to the end flee. And then he just stood in the middle of the field, where silence and smoke remained instead of an army. Wallace did not retreat, he disappeared. Some said he fled to France, others said he was hidden by monks. In fact, he simply became invisible to his own country. His name remained, but people grew tired of whispering it aloud. When he was caught a few years later, his betrayal came as no surprise. John de Menteith, a former comrade in arms, handed Wallace over to the English, not out of malice but out of calculation. In a world where the victors write the laws, loyalty was worthless. He was brought to London not for trial but for show. Justice played no role here. The main thing was for everyone to see how those who raised their hand against the empire ended up. The streets were filled with people before dawn. Some came out of curiosity, others to make sure their fears were still justified. Wallace was dragged behind a horse on a rope, face down on the stone, through the entire city. His body no longer looked like that of a warrior, but he held himself upright. The crowd shouted and threw dirt at him, but he did not react. He just stared straight ahead. In prison before his execution, he was read the charges: treason, sacrilege, murder. When asked if he admitted his guilt, he replied calmly, "I could not betray the King of England because I never swore allegiance to him. It was not a defense, it was a limit." There was no point in explaining further. At Smithfield, August 23, 1305, he was executed by hang, draw, and quarter, a public ritual of intimidation. We will omit the details. Suffice it to say that it was the most severe punishment of the time. When it was all over, all that remained of the body was what could be hung up in cities, to remind people that even death must serve the crown. The head was impaled on a spear on London Bridge. It was smeared with resin so that it would remain visible to passers-by for longer. The rest of the body was sent north, to the cities that had once opened their gates to him. England wanted peace, and it got it, but with it came memory. The repeated block of this part has been deleted. After the execution, England thought it was over. The king had his revenge, the rebel had his punishment. But sometimes death does what armies cannot. It changes memory. News of the execution spread faster than orders could stop it. In taverns and on roads, among soldiers and monks, everyone talked about him. Some whispered that he shouted freedom before his death. Others swore they saw his soul leave the fire not with a scream, but with a smile. No one knew which was true, but everyone wanted to believe their own version. A few years later, poets began to compose songs. In them, Wallace was no longer a man, but a symbol, a giant with a sword who struck down the English with a single blow. Peasants painted him on wooden shields. Soldiers carved his initials on knife handles. And where the English hung parts of his body, children brought stones and laid them under the walls, as if on a grave. Thus a myth was born. Not because someone invented it, but because people did not want to forget. They needed to believe that Wallace's death had meaning and that everyone who dies for their land becomes greater than it. His name became a test. Whoever said it aloud showed which side they were on. Scotland remained divided for a long time. Some sought peace, others sought revenge. But each new generation, born under foreign flags, began again with his story. Historians argued about who he really was, a criminal, an avenger, a patriot. But that was the point. The state saw him as a threat, the people saw him as a reminder of themselves. And in the end, when centuries passed, It was not his death that remained, but its consequence. The idea that freedom does not begin with a throne, it begins with a refusal to bow down. His body was long gone, but the symbol remained. Not on the coat of arms, not on coins, in memory. The head on London Bridge rotted away, the parts of the body sent to different cities disappeared, but the name did not. It outlived all who judged him. They say that empires fall not by the sword, but because people stop believing in them. Perhaps this is what began on the day when the crowd watched the execution, and for the first time thought not of fear, but of justice. At that time, they did not yet know that they were not watching the end, but the beginning. Microtransition. It seemed that memory had been scattered along with the body parts, but the opposite turned out to be true. After that day when the crowd watched the execution, Scotland remained a country of fear and silence for a long time. But silence is not the end. It is the ground. A few years later, footsteps thundered again in the north. Those who had been silent yesterday now spoke with names, not titles. They remembered not royal seals, but people who knew how to stand. Among them was Robert Bruce, a man with a lineage, with doubts, with mistakes. And yet he did what the times demanded. He gathered the country from the ruins of fear. In 1314, at Bannockburn, June 23rd to 24th, the earth shook not from the cavalry, but from the fact that so many people simultaneously ceased to be afraid. The English army was larger, heavier, more confident, as always. But the Scottish shields stood like ears of corn that the wind cannot break. When the dust settled, the field belonged to those who came without the right to victory, and took it. 6 years after Bannockburn, in 1320, the monastery in Arbroath was filled with human voices transformed into a single text. The letter to the Pope, what we now call the Declaration of Arbroath, April 6, 1320, did not beg or justify itself. It said simple things. That freedom is not the mercy of kings, but the right of the people. That the king is needed as long as he serves this right. That the people are not created for the throne, but the throne for the people. There is a thought there that is ahead of its time. If the king betrays freedom, the people have the right to seek another. Wallace is not named in these lines, but he is there, between the words, like a breath. Because every we in Arbroath grew out of one eye that refused to bow down. A dead body cannot sign a letter, but it can teach a hand to hold a pen without trembling. Meanwhile, London continued to be London. Bridges, markets, walls, habits. The head was removed from the bridge when its time came. The rains washed away the blood, and the merchants traded again. And only occasionally did someone stop in the middle of the crowd, as if remembering for a moment that once upon a time, people here did not look at fishing baskets, but at a face that could no longer respond. Memory is also a bargain. You take something away, you leave something behind. But there are names that cannot be cheapened. Scotland did not suddenly become perfect. It continued to quarrel, make peace, fight for its borders, and for the meaning of those borders. But one stable synonym appeared in its vocabulary: dignity, as another name for freedom. Not a flag, not a seal, not a coat of arms, the habit of standing up straight. What remains of Wallace? Not bones. They were scattered along the roads and have long since turned to dust. What remains is the path, from silence to voice. A lesson remains. The body can be taken away, but the example cannot. And there remains a question that each generation receives as an uncomfortable legacy. What will you do when it's your turn? We like to think that great names are about the distant past. But history always happens here and now, with a voice that is heard not by kings, but by people on the street. Wallace did not bring a crown or put an heir on the throne. He did something else. He showed that a throne without the consent of the people stands like a bridge without supports. And if someone ever tells you that everything has been decided and it's too late to change anything, remember the man who was dragged through the city face down on a stone, and still managed to turn his defeat into a beginning. Because sometimes history doesn't end when the body stops breathing. It just learns to speak with its true voice.